Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Dave Rolsky, and I'm going to be talking about test class Moose, which is a testing toolkit module on CPAN. I did not create it. It was created by a guy named Curtis Poe, who also goes by Ovid online. But I've been the maintainer of it for a while, and I've used it for a lot of different things. And it's a really nice package. So the first question we should ask is, what problem does this solve? Why do you want this sort of tool? So as opposed to just using kind of the core things that ship with Perl of test more and a whole bunch of .t files. So if you have a really big test suite and you want more organization than just a bunch of files, this can be really helpful. In particular, if you have a test suite where there's a lot of setup and teardown for your tests, especially if you're sharing a lot of test code between your tests, sharing a lot of that setup and teardown or other things that are shared, this is really useful. It lets you use, the OO principles and design that you're familiar with to build your test suite. It also addresses the slowness of starting Perl over and over with a lot of .t files, although Chad's going to talk about test2 harness, which can also help with that. But anyway, with this, everything gets loaded once, and then you can run things in parallel, and it's much faster. So what else does it have? It has some other features. It has some nice reporting features, so you can get a bunch of information about what passed and failed, and this is useful, say, if you want to integrate with the CI system and output, like, usually they take some horrific XML file, and you can generate one of those. It also provides timing data for your entire test suite, so basically every method that's run, including setup and teardown, it will record the timing. And that's something I added because at my previous employer, we had a very large test suite, and it was taking close to an hour at one point. And we were trying to figure out, why. We knew, okay, yeah, there's lots of tests and so on, but what is it that's taking so much time? So I wrote this, and it's kind of a very rough profiler. And I wrote something that takes that JSON data and turns it into a flame graph that unfortunately never got released. But that data can be really useful. You can find kind of the top places that are slowest. And you can also write your tests using Moose. So if you like using Moose, then this is great. So here's an example of what a really simple test class looks like. So it's in a package like all classes in Perl. We use test class Moose. And if you're familiar with Moose, it's a lot like writing use Moose, except this declares that we're a test class. And then let's say we're testing this user model. And then we have a subroutine. You get, again, it's OO, so $self is your test class. And there are some things you can do with that, and I'll show you a little bit. And then you also get just the normal Perl test stuff that you might be used to with test more. If you don't want test more, and you don't, because Chad's also going to talk about you're going to talk about the test2 suite, some much better tools than what's in test more, then you can not import any of that stuff. You just use test class Moose, you give it a flag -bear, and you don't get that, and then you can use the much better tools that he'll tell you about. So you also get all the Moose helpers, so things like has and with and extends. So again, you're writing your test classes just like anything else with Moose. And you also get strict and warnings, and again, just like Moose. So any method that starts with test underscore is a test method. And a class can have many such test methods. And it's pretty straightforward. So test classes, they're Moose classes, so you can have attributes. And then we have, again, a test method, test user full name. We can access that attribute that we've just declared. So we can say self user because we've declared the user attribute. I didn't show the builder, but the assumption is that this returns some sort of user object. And that's how you can test it. Does this make sense so far? Any questions, especially about kind of the Moose aspects? All right.
So my app user in this case is presumably a Moose class that has all the full name.
So that brings up a great question that somebody asked me before the talk. He said, so presumably my app user is a Moose class. It doesn't matter what my app user is, okay? It could be a Moose class. It could be a class you wrote. It could be a it could be anything. It doesn't matter. The test class is a Moose class. The thing you are testing does not need to use Moose or Moo. It can be anything. So if you have a legacy application that's not using any of those, and I'm sorry, then if you want to like enhance your test suite by using this, then that's absolutely no problem. It's totally, there's no connection really between your test classes and the classes you're testing other than the actual test code you write. You can also use roles in your test classes. Again, this is just like regular Moose stuff. So we have this, we're testing our car model. We use test class Moose. Again, that exports the same things that Moose exports, so with and has and so on. And so we can say we have this test role, so maybe we have a whole bunch of models that produce JSON, and we want to share that test logic between them. We can put that in a role, and presumably that role provides our underscore test JSON. And I should note that underscore test is not going to be treated as a test method by test class Moose. There's also these things called control methods. So I mentioned this whole setup and teardown thing that's really common when you get to bigger test suites. So while all methods that start with test underscore are test methods, there are some that have special names and you should not use them except for their special effect. So we have startup, which is before any of the methods run. We have shutdown, which is after all the methods run. And then we have setup and teardown that are before and after each method. So if you need to do some sort of fixture setup or preparing a temporary file system, a temporary directory on the file system to test with, whatever you want, you can do it with these methods. And they'll run once per, or you can define these in multiple classes and they run for that class. Does that make sense? All right, so there's a lot of things you can do with the control methods. I kind of mentioned some of them. Setting up external integrations, fixtures. If you want to start a service, if you're running some sort of integration test, you can print out extra diagnostic output if that's helpful for you. And you can also use it to skip entire classes and skip individual methods inside a test class. So I'll show you what that looks like. So we're in our startup method, which runs before the entire class, before any of the methods in the class are run. And we call self test skip, and we pass a method. And presumably we're doing this conditionally. Maybe, I don't know, it doesn't work on Windows, so we check if we're on Windows or whatever. And if we pass that during test startup, test class Moose will take note of that fact and skip the entire class for you. And you can also skip a single method. Again, setup is the per method control method that runs before the test method. And again, we call test skip. And this, it's a little clunky because we have to figure out what method we're about to run. So we look at the test report to get our current method. It's not the most beautiful thing, but it does work. Any questions on the control methods? I'm going kind of quick because this is just a 20-minute talk, so yeah.
Can you have multiple, or more specifically, what if you're in an inheritance or role-consuming situation, but you're classing your role specified test start?
So the question was, can you have essentially multiple startup or other control methods, particularly with inheritance or roles? So the way that's going to work is exactly like it works in Moose, or really regular Perl. For inheritance, it's just like regular Perl, right? If you call the super class explicitly, if you call self super test startup, that'll work. You could also use Moose's override and the lower class super. With roles, if a class implements a method locally that overrides what's in the role, if a class inherits something and that it also gets from a role, the role overrides what's in the parent. Of course, the role method could call super, but that's insane. So yeah, you can use the typical, like however you would do this with Moose will just work this way. You certainly can't define multiple methods of the same name, but that's just Perl. All right, to-do tests, this is exactly the same as it always has been. You can do it with the test more way. You define a local $to-do, and that just works. And again, if you're using Chad stuff, there's better helpers, if I recall correctly. So yeah, this will just work exactly the way you're used to. And then, of course, you want to run your test classes, right? So these are all just normal Perl classes. They're .pm files. So if you run prove, it's not going to find any of them. So you need some sort of little bit of connective glue between them. And it used to be you had to write a bunch of this, and then I wrote this CLI class, which I think is really handy. So this is your .t file. It just looks like this. And the CLI class gives you a whole bunch of options, and I'll show you some of those. You can also implement your own runner, if you like, using the role that actually implements most of the logic here. So instead, you can provide your own CLI class to add additional options if that is something you need to do. So you put this in your .t file, and then you can run it with prove, or you can run it with Yath, which is the new, yet another test harness. Yes?
I just want to point out that you can also run test class moves files.
Oh, okay. So Chad pointed out that Yath, the new test2 harness runner, can run test class moose stuff directly because it has a plugin. So that's pretty neat. All right. So how does it know what to run? That's a good question, right? So what the CLO module is going to do under the hood is use something that ships in the distro called test class moose : load. And by default, that just looks at all the classes that are loaded. Sorry. Yes. Okay, I'm not explaining this well. So what the CLI does is find your test classes and loads them. And then there's something else that looks at all the classes in memory that are using Moose and just sees which ones subclass test class Moose, which happens automatically when you use test class Moose. So basically, if you use test class Moose and then you run this runner, it will figure stuff out. And what it looks for by default, it just looks under t/lib for all your test classes, and it'll just load everything in there for you. Again, there are ways to override this. You can put it in a different directory. You can kind of change it how this works, but if you just use this thing out of the box, you put stuff in t/lib in any hierarchy you want under there, and it'll just work. So I mentioned that the CLI provides some additional options, and the way that works is if you're using prove itself takes options, and then you want to pass additional options to the test class Moose CLI, and you separate those with that double colon, which I've never seen used anywhere else, but I really like it, and I wish more programs would use it. And I think I had to debate with Chad about this. But I think it's really nice because it's much clearer than many of the other ways of doing this. So anyway, the -lv is being passed to prove. The -- classes in a class name is being passed to test class Moose CLI. So what this is saying is I only want you to run this one class. So that's something that's definitely going to come up a lot. You just want to run one class or a subset of your classes. That's an option. And in addition to passing a class name, you can also pass a path to a test class's PM file or multiples of those, and it does the right thing. It says, oh, you gave me this file. Okay, I know which class this belongs to. I'll just run that one. So that's pretty nice. You can also run things in parallel. Now, of course, you might know prove can run things in parallel as well. Prove has its own -j option. But what that does is for running multiple .t files in parallel. If you're using only test class Moose, you only have one .t file. So you have to tell test class Moose itself that you want to run things in parallel. And it does a good job of that. And again, it'll load everything, load all your classes once, and then fork, so it's much faster. And you don't end up respawning the Perl interpreter over and over. Yes?
This is briefly a dumb question, but can you prove the CLI module can be told, okay, only load this one? Not all of them.
So the question was, can the CLI module be told only load this one and not the rest? I think if you just pass this, it does that. Yeah, it'll only, I need to double check because I wrote this code a while ago, but I'm pretty sure it just loads the things you pass. If you don't pass anything, it tries to load everything. There's some other test runner options that it takes, so you can randomize the method or the test class order. You can run select methods from inside test classes, which you can specify essentially by name or regex. You can combine that with classes. So you can say, run this one class, and then you can specify -- methods and run just one method inside the class. Again, this is very handy. You're working on fixing a bug. You've written a new test method for just that bug because you always write tests before fixing a bug. Am I correct? Good, good. Nobody's disagreeing with me. So then you can just run that method repeatedly until it passes. And there's a bunch of other options. I'm not going to cover them all. So I mentioned there's this reporting thing. So there's this report class that ships with it, and you can get access to it inside the test classes by calling self-report. And we saw how you can use that to get the current method name. You can get all sorts of information as well at the end of the test class run. This might be a case where you replace the CLI with your own code, and you get access to this, and you can see everything that passed and failed and skipped. We have that timing data. There's a whole bunch of other stuff you can do with it. That all kind of falls under the heading of advanced things I won't cover in any detail today, but I just want you to know this is possible. I mentioned the timing report and how I used it to produce a flame graph, which was really handy. And actually, one of the things we did with it was figure out how to partition classes so that we could run like groups of classes in parallel that each would take approximately the same amount of time instead of running all the slow ones together and a few fast ones. And I felt very clever for implementing this. And we actually would even save this data between runs in our CI system so we could like have the next run use what it knew from the last one. Again, cool advanced features that we won't go into detail today, but these are the kinds of things you can do with this that would be a little harder if you were just using prove and a bunch of .t files. And that's all I have, but I do have some time for questions. Yes?
So I know nothing about test 2. Does it play well with test 2? Looking forward to test. Wow. Does this integrate well with test 2 as well?
Yeah, so that is a good, the question was, how does this play with test 2? By the way, if you haven't looked at the test 2 stuff, you can just, well, there'll be a couple talks about some of it here at this conference. If you're interested in learning more about testing, I highly recommend it. Like I said, the test 2 suite tools that Chad has written are significantly better than test more, both in terms of how you write your tests and the diagnostic output they display. And when I write code in Go, which I do a lot at work now, I'm just so jealous because it's so bad compared to what I get from Perl. And so the question is, does this play nicely together? So yes, like I said, you cannot load test more. Actually, it's test most, if you're familiar with that. And instead, opt into loading test 2. You just use test 2, blah, 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 whatever tools you need. And under the hood, test class Moose itself has been rewritten entirely to use the test 2 infrastructure. So it should play well with the ecosystem as a whole. So for example, things like I wrote a plugin that does a warnings check at the end of tests, and it should work with that. And just in general, it should play nice. And like Chad said, the test 2 harness actually has support for test class Moose directly. So yeah, overall, it should just work. You know, famous last words. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned support of grouping tests. Is that just by kind of, how do you group them until they run these together now?
So he's saying, I mentioned support for grouping tests. How does that work? So in that case, what we did was we had a totally, trying to remember this, it's been several years since I worked at the place where I implemented this. It's not like built into it. By default, when you run things in parallel, it just kind of goes through in a, I think, a more or less arbitrary order. Maybe it sorts things, I don't know, and spins them off into, you know, one per process till the processes are full, then waits till there's a process free, and so on. You could certainly override that. I think at the time I did that, the internals probably were in a state that I couldn't do it the way I would do now, and I suspect it was actually like a higher layer, kind of like the CLI class didn't exist, and yes, it's all coming back to me. I wrote something very much like that, but very much customized for our system, and it handled the grouping and so on. So yeah, it's not really built in. It would still need to be something you do yourself. I don't know if that'll go into here. Ovid was making some noise about writing a new version of this that kind of, there's a lot of things about this. I think it's a really good tool. There's a lot of things maybe about the internals that are kind of like, maybe you do them differently if you started from scratch. So it might be something that would go into that tool. But yeah, you could always try to bug my former employer, but I probably should like shout them out by name so you bug them to release that code. Not that they're against releasing the code, it's just like nobody's gotten around to it. All right, I am out of time, so thank you very much.